It's about that time of year again. Thrones of Delay is on the horizon, the latest victim of circumstance in a long slew of Warhammer 3 mishaps and missed opportunities, but perhaps a chance to right the ship and put the last 6 months behind us for good. Will it be redemption and a new chapter of glory in the annals of Total War, or a sickly wet fart from a plague bearer's bum? Probably not a legacy-defining moment or anything here, we don't need to oversell it, but I'd say it's pretty important for them to get this one right. Nurgle, Dwarfs, and the Empire of Man are on the agenda, and the big question today is what will be included in this newest DLC, the first since the much-maligned Shadows of Change sometime last August. Done this many times before, you know the drill at this point. We're going to make some predictions and informed speculation about the lords, heroes, units, and mechanics included, based on info and hints provided by the devs themselves, and hopefully paint a lurid and holistic picture that binds the themes and rivalries together into one digestible package, making it easier to understand all of it in one sitting. And this will be a pretty long one because there's a lot of info to cover. Friendly reminder, this is the new blueprint CA will follow for the immediate future. There's no guarantee it will extend past Thrones of Decay. It's in fact entirely possible they scrap the 3-race setup for Slaanesh and Khorne and their respective updates, but everything on screen is guaranteed to come by the end of April, provided there are no further delays. So first things first. It is a Nurgle DLC. We're going to focus on Nurgle to begin with, and I think pretty much everyone is in agreement here. Tamurkhan, the Maggot Lord, is the biggest dickus, the HBIC, the head boobos in charge, and the newest legendary lord for Nurgle. It's been hinted at pretty heavily by Rich Aldrich, head of the Warhammer 3 post-launch content team, and more importantly, he is the most logical to headline a DLC for the Plaguefather when considering his rivalry with the Empire and the content they are missing. Essentially, if you don't have Tamurkhan, you don't really have a theme for this DLC, but his inclusion immediately brings the unit list, legendary heroes, mounts, and other factions into clear focus, and the reason for that is because he had his own damn army book. How many times have we talked about Thrones of Chaos in the past? It's where the Chaos Dwarfs reside, it's where so many creepy crawlies of Nurgle reside, it's where the forces of Nolan were fully fleshed out, and so it will almost certainly be the inspiration and main source material for Thrones of Decay. And a fitting choice the Corpse Maggot is. One of the nastiest and most intriguing designs imaginable, he is a gigantor flesh-eating worm who can burrow deep into the chest and bowels of a host body and work it like a meat puppet. Kinda like the Yerks from Animorphs, only instead of leaving the host's mind in prison but intact, he's like 50 times bigger, a million times more foul, and he tunnels out your insides before making monkeys dance to his tune. His most recognizable form is that of the Ogre Tyrant Karaka Break Mountain. That is almost certainly going to be the form we see him in-game, but throughout his story arc he takes multiple forms, and that may very well form the foundation of his campaign mechanics in-game. Riding the Toad Dragon Bubalos, he will be a hulking, monstrous freak with breath weapons of unspeakable foulness, lashing tongues, and insane special rules. Good example being, if he was slain on the tabletop, he could choose any model within range to possess, and if he was successful, would literally eat them from the inside out, then assume control of their stats, magic weapons, and armor. Basically, he's a legendary lord who can push products all by himself, and that makes him one of, if not the single best and most logical choices for CA to include here. He would start his Warhammer 3 campaigns in place of the Maggotkin near Kadatha, in the ruins of Zanbai-Jin, where he won the Great Game Free-for-All and was chosen as a champion of the Chaos Gods, united with Drazuath the Yashin from the Chaos Dwarfs, swept through the Darklands and across the World's Edge Mountains, and eventually lay siege to the Great Bastion of Nuln in the heart of the Empire proper. But there are other options, of course, and so we'd be neglecting those choices if we didn't cover them now. The Glotkin, my personal favorite for Nurgle, would be an amazing addition, but are frankly pretty unlikely to see service until an End Times expansion, and at the speed Game 3 is progressing right now, it might be a miracle if we manage to get Neferata, Nagash, and Thankwall, maybe the 3 most iconic characters remaining. So the idea of going into End Time stuff right now seems like it's pretty far away, if even possible. So at least for now, I'd say put Putrid Blight Kings, Gutrot Spume, Pox Magath Trifecta, and unfortunately, the Glotkin way on the back burner, and maybe we'll revisit in 3 to 4 years if the momentum for this series hasn't fully died away by that point. On the other hand, I think a lot of old heads would like to see Volnir the Reaper, one of those OGs from much earlier editions, but I just don't think he has the same mass market appeal, neither in terms of popularity from the invested community, nor from the outsiders who might stumble onto him in a trailer. I think we all know which model is more unique and would get the masses more excited when compared between Volnir the Reaper and Tamurkhan. Now we do have confirmation there will be a free legendary lord this time, and I believe that role will fall to Epidemius, Nurgle's chosen tallyman, for a multitude of reasons. Number one, he is going to be in the game. We know that. I believe all the 8th edition heralds will be in some capacity, whether that be as heroes or lords. Not all the other Chaos factions are as weird as Tzeentch when it comes to this particular topic, where the Raven God has the Changeling and the Blue Scribes as his herald representatives, but I do expect to see the Mask for Slaanesh, Uzul Skulltaker for Khorne, and Epidemius for Nurgle. At the same time, he is not going to be the headlining paid character, because no one in their right mind would want to pay for him, right? He's basically just a generic herald, a plague bearer on a palanquin throne, with a few bits and bobs to make him a teeny bit more interesting, but really nothing that would severely drive hype unto itself. Traditionally, that makes him a perfect candidate for a free lord slot, which isn't to say that CA doesn't put effort into their free characters, but he's simply not and will never be on that level where he can sell $25 lord packs all by himself. And I do need to make it clear, again, CA have confirmed there will be a free legendary lord coming with this update, not just heroes as well. Speaking on that $25 lord pack format, I would not be shocked in the slightest if we see a change in that DLC format once this one's all said and done. Everything was probably already locked in for Tamurkhan after the initial drama wave in fall of last year, and they delayed once or twice to account for it in all the new units. But in some ways, I feel like this format and pacing is kind of unsustainable in its current path, that even with all the additional stuff, $25 is simply going to be too steep for some players to justify, and that's probably a segment of the player base that Creative Assembly would like to keep around. That the turnaround time of once every 6 to 8 months just kills momentum, right? And they were certainly hoping that the price and initial offering would be accepted by the community, but with Shadows of Change, it clearly was not, and now that it hasn't, and they felt they had to add a bunch of extra stuff to compensate, they might want to shift gears here and try something new moving forward, or rather, go back to older formats when we go to the next DLC after this one. Because those Frostworms and Celestial Lions are obviously squeezing on those margins. They weren't initially supposed to include those things. They ended up doing that just as a quote-unquote gesture of goodwill, but maybe that was something a lot of you think CA needed to do to earn back their good graces. So, if Epidemius is the free LC Lord, as a lot of people are surmising, and there have kind of been rumors about floating around the community, who then should be the legendary hero? And the answer is almost certainly Kha'Zix the Befouled. He's pretty much perfect for the role, introduces a new mount we've been expecting for a while, the Rot Beast, and a new thematic unit, the Rot Knights. Kha'Zix, like much of what will follow here, is straight from the Throne of Chaos book, serving as the Chief Lieutenant and Cavalry Commander for Tamurkhan, leading a contingent of Rot Knights astride monstrous slavering man-bear pigs. These would be a straight upgrade over Nurgle Chaos Knights, fewer in number, probably 32 per unit or so, similar to Blood Crushers and Skull Crushers of Khorne, with AP, Fear, and Regeneration. That could be a scary unit, dude. Regen on a Cav unit that actually hits hard, that could potentially be a meta-defining addition. I don't expect their stat line to nearly be on the level of, like, say, the Skull Crushers of Khorne. They do not have that kind of killing power. They won't have quite the same mobility, and certainly not that raw, just in-your-face, destroy-you kind of feel, but I could see them being very good. The fact that they can disengage and regen is super uncommon for a cavalry unit. And then we just dive into the stuff that's talked about in the official army book, which has a long list of units from multiple factions. War Mammoths, Pox Riders, and Plague Toads are already in. They've been present since Warhammer 3's launch, which leaves Bile Trolls, Plague Ogres, and Toad Dragons. I'd kind of like to see Bile Trolls as a more powerful single entity with a breath attack like Throg, similar to how they were implemented in Vermintide 2, but they may very well just end up being slightly more elite trolls with a short-range breath weapon called Infected Vomit. And while Plague Ogres are not officially a unit in Thrones of Chaos, I don't know if they ever had their own individual stat line, they are described in detail as forming the vanguard of Tamurkhan's hordes, especially when he steals the corpse of the Ogre Tyrant and beats the Dawi Zar into submission. There's a decent amount of focus on Plague Ogres in the story. I think it makes a lot of sense to include them as a unit here, because we've already seen mutated Ogres in the past. Chaos Ogres are a unit that's currently missing from the Chaos rosters. That was an 8th edition unit. And then, of course, we also have the Abominable Hulks or whatever for the Vampire Coast. But Toad Dragons are for sure the centerpiece monster here, with a devastating breath attack, a lashing tongue, a massive HP pool and stat line designed for tanking through damage and devastating enemy formations, not to mention a badass looking model. Then we could... I'm not editing that out. Nurgle, bitch! Then we could get to Pestigores, Pox Maggots, Basilisks, or any number of other horrific creatures in that 5th unit slot, but that one's kind of up in the air. Gonna be kind of hard to narrow that down to one. So, popping up on your screen right now is a general overview of unit expectations for Thrones of Decay by Ain't Impressed on Reddit. To be clear, I don't agree with everything here. I will explain those differences momentarily, but it's an easy format to read and follow. It should help give a general idea of what to expect, so thanks to them for compiling it. Overall, it's fairly close to what I think we will get, but of course, there's the narrative to consider as well. The Nemesis Crown will be the MacGuffin, the focal point around which this entire three-way war will spin, and CA have told us explicitly it will be similar to the Sword of Cain, granting the wielder great power but coming at a terrible price. The long and short of it is, the dwarf runesmith Alaric, who also crafted the 12 rune fangs of the Empire, wanted to make a crown that would share wisdom across generations, so that every king that wore the crown would learn from his predecessors and become even better than the last one. Ideally, this would culminate in a golden age of leadership where each newest king would be better and wiser than the last one, but the rune retained so much power, it would inevitably destroy whatever item he inscribed it on, so it wasn't really working, until one day, he imbued it with Warpstone. Go figure. And naturally, this warped the crown, and instilled deep within it a hunger and a need for evil. Now, it would not only channel knowledge and learning, but also malicious intent, passing down even the tiniest shred of wicked thought and action. The more kings would wear the crown, the more monstrous the next would become, but of course this would not be common knowledge amongst the people vying for control of it. In fact, only a few select dwarfs likely know the full extent of its evil, and the Empire, for example, would want to harness its power for the good of mankind, channeling their belief in the God King Sigmar Heldenhammer. So they would still want this powerful artifact, they just probably don't fully know the depths of its depravity. From a gameplay perspective, the Nemesis Crown would obviously have its own identity in terms of buffs and debuffs, similar ideas to content we've seen before perhaps, but unlike the Sword of Cain, I'd expect it to help with governance, defense, and morale, rather than being an artifact of pure aggression, rage, and killing power like the Sword of Cain was. Now, before we get into the Empire and Dwarf sections, I do want to make it clear that I hope CA retains Nurgle's identity and uniqueness in campaign. There's been a lot of talk about Kugath and Nurgle, and what a pain his recruitment and building cycles are, and while there certainly are issues there, like their tech tree being outdated, and having a bunch of really useless stuff like climate things that really only tie into the Realms of Chaos campaign, I'm hoping that CA doesn't cave too hard on their unique playstyle and just super buff everything for the sake of convenience. There is a bunch of unique and really interesting campaign features for Nurgle that just need some tweaks, but deserve to stay, rather than being nuked into irrelevancy just to make Nurgle feel super strong all the time. One really important element of Nurgle, and one thing that I think really makes them special, is the fact that they are all about waxing and waning in terms of their power spikes. They can ebb and flow, they can feel weak, maybe in the early game, certainly, but even in mid, late game, there may be times when they're not quite as strong, but then when they wax, when the gibbous moon finally goes big time, and you got Geheimnis not glowing tight, and green, and scary, that is when Nurgle shines brightest, and that is when they become one of, if not the most powerful factions in the entire game. That has always been what Nurgle is about. A slow build-up, but a really powerful set of power spikes when you get it going. And I have to say, it's been a somewhat disturbing trend we've seen for the Changeling and for the Beastmen, for example, who are just hyper overpowered and thoughtless, basically unlosable campaigns that don't fit Warhammer Fantasy quite as thematically as they should. And we saw that with both their DLCs when they came out. Like the Beastmen, being this world-ending superpower 20 turns into the campaign after their rework, it's a weird juxtaposition of what they are in the lore and how they're known to survive. The Cloven Ones are not world beaters in the source material, they are scroungers, ambushers, and opportunists, only becoming truly mighty when a Beast Lord or Doombull with sufficient power and prestige can muster them into an organized Bray herd. But of course, Silence and the Fury made them absurdly strong and easy. So when that Beastmen rework came out, Beastmen went from being like a kind of trash tier faction to being just absurdly strong in campaign, to the point where it was probably a bit overboard, if not extremely overboard. Nurgle can and should be made more fun. They could use some buffs and reworking a bit, but I don't want to see them become a mindless cakewalk either, and I don't want them to lose their core identity on the campaign map, which I think was initially implemented fairly well, despite some prevailing sentiment from the community saying otherwise. So with that out of the way, now we come to the Empire. On that Reddit post, I agree with most of it, but of course the Knights of War are already in the game as state troops, and Boris is not going to be the free LC Lord either, I do not believe. Yes, Boris will have his day. Yes, there is a logical argument to be made for the Cult of Ulrich and Middenheim here in Thrones of Decay, but no, I do not think it is their time quite yet, and I said as much, really, in my Ulrich video from 9 months ago. The Empire could easily handle 2 more DLCs, including this one, and as the faces of the franchise, really, I would not be surprised. In fact, I think they should get 1 more after this one, and this one will focus on Nuln, because that is the faction opposite Tamurkhan in Throne of Chaos, which means Elspeth von Draken on her Great Carmine Dragon as Legendary Lord. Now, Elspeth is a bit of a controversial figure. There's some who believe she's a Mary Sue, she's absurdly powerful kind of out of nowhere, and that her death magic and dragon combined don't really fit the Empire very well in a thematic sense, that she kind of takes away from the shine of characters like Karl Franz when she has a super powerful mount and is dropping purple suns like Manfred. Totally understand those complaints, even if I don't fully agree with them, but as I'm sure we're all aware, a lot of characters in Warhammer Fantasy Battle are Mary Sues and Gary Stews, including some of the most iconic and recognizable characters in the setting. They are described as world beaters, bringers of Armageddon, able to destroy regiments or armies with cataclysmic spells by the flick of their finger, and yet have very little to zero actual character development or growth to reach that point. So I'm not really sure if that's a good argument for why a character should not be included, even though it's reasonable if you're not a big fan of that style or design. Even though she doesn't embody the Empire as well as some other characters visually, like say Kurt Hellborg, Marius Leitdorf, or Boris Todbringer, in my opinion, she offers a lot more than they do on the gameplay side and on the model side as well. A Deathcaster on a dragon with some really cool special rules like entering ethereal form with Darkwalker will make her stand out in the roster more than a Knight Commander on horseback would. In my book, Boris has her beat in terms of overall thematics with the full Cult of Ulrich roster, but it's only because of that roster that I'm excited for him, because he alone doesn't really bring much to the table, in my opinion, unless he has his Teutogan Guard, Knights of the White Wolf, Wolf Priests, and our Ulrichs, that sort of thing. He just isn't that exciting from a Total War perspective, as badass as he may be in the lore. Don't mind bringing him in the occasional multiplayer battle, don't mind using him in campaign, but I don't think he himself is that special. His units are though, and so if you're talking the full Cult of Ulrich spectrum, then I think they're cooler than Nuln and Elspeth von Draken. So, when it comes to Elspeth, this Dark Lady of Nuln is the advisor and battlefield representative for the Elector Countess of Wesenland, and as such, we should expect this to be a Nuln-focused DLC, with a start position in Nuln, go figure, which means gunpowder, explosives, more gunpowder, and a new focus on the Imperial Gunnery School. Engineers with mechanical horses, Castellan engineer Jubal Falk and his Nuln Ironsides handgun regiment, Theodore Bruckner the Titan headsman, Hochland long rifles, and then maybe one or both of the Celestial Huracanum and the Marienburg landship. Theodore Bruckner is the most logical legendary hero choice, though that role could certainly go to Jubal Falk as well, as he is the personal champion of Nuln and ultimately the one who duels Tamurkhan to the death moments before he ascends as a demon prince of Nurgle. He is an executioner and a fist for justice, and goddamn does Theodore Bruckner die an absolutely horrible and hardcore death, all but winning his duel against Tamurkhan until his maggot form ejects from his previous meat puppet, fastens itself to Theodore's face, then burrows deep into his body. But with the Baleflame amulet gifted to him by Elspeth von Draken, Theodore goes supernova, explodes the Chaos Horde, and ultimately carries the day after a brave last stand. He rides a massive terror-causing demigryph named Reaper, a mount that Empire captains should also get, demigryphs that is, becomes unbreakable during duels, and explodes when killed in melee, a feature that I hope would do real damage this time and not fizzle out like a wet fart like we see for Phoenixes. Would be very interesting if there was a duelist character that you did not want to kill in melee. Essentially, you'd want to get them really low, then run away, let the unbreakable wear off, and let their leadership drop, and then run. Because if you strike a killing blow with him, then he might take, I don't know, a third, half of your Lord's HP in melee. That would be kind of an interesting mechanic that you'd actually have to watch out for and worry about, rather than some of the limp death throw moves that some of these characters or units like Phoenixes currently have in Warhammer 3. I don't think I've ever really seen a Phoenix do a lot of damage when it dies. Wouldn't mind if Theodore Bruckner and his Balefire Amulet actually did something impactful when he falls. The Celestial Huracanum is an 8th edition unit that would utilize similar assets and movement protocols to stuff that's already in the game, War Altar of Sigmar and Luminarch, for example, which is a big advantage and points towards its inclusion, and it would summon tornadoes, lightning, and meteors with its Storm of Shemtech, operating as a locus for magical energy and allowing your other casters to utilize more winds. Meanwhile, the Marienburg Landship is another Throne of Chaos unit, a poor imitation of steam tanks, but filled to the brim with deck sweepers, pistoliers, culverin cannons, and its own crushing mass running over anything that gets in its way. Incredibly slow, unwieldy, and prone to mishaps, like its boiler room straight up exploding and killing every crew member on board, but deadly at medium to close range and, as you'd expect, a gigantic HP pool. As for the Imperial Gunnery School itself, I don't remember if it was carried over to Warhammer 3 as a landmark or not, but it did exist as a special landmark in games 1 and 2 at least, and this is where some of the greatest military minds in both the Empire and the Dwarfen Kingdoms teach ballistics and forge their weapons of war. The training provided there at the Imperial Gunnery School in Nuln, combined with heavily armored handgunners like the Nuln Ironsides, and what are essentially sniper rifles from Hawkland, should ensure that the Empire comes out the other side of this DLC as one of, if not the premier firepower factions in the game, with a lot more options for supporting their war machines via the Master Engineers, and a lot more color and flavor on their roster too. I personally get why people love the Empire, but in Warhammer 3 right now, I do find them a little bit boring. I find their roster a little bit boring. I think a Nuln-focused DLC will add a lot of the extra flair and flavor that will make them a more appealing choice for players. Not that they aren't already, they're the most played faction in the game by a large margin. And then there are the Dwarfs. There's some recent news found by members of the community that Karak Azorn, the capital of the Mountains of Moor region, is a 10-slot settlement in assembly kit and showed up in star position regions, so it seems it may very well be the next turning location for the Dawi, if those files are to be believed. In the lore, the Angry Fist Ogre tribe laid siege to this hold, and eventually broke inside it with the help of 3 Stonehorns, gorging themselves on meat, beer, and gold, while the surviving Dawi fled to holds far afield. In-game, the landmark Karak Azorn Great Hall can be built by the Dwarf and Ogre Kingdom factions, granting beer kegs, control, and income, so it's definitely one of those Karaks you would like to get. Any of the landmark ones, just from a flavor perspective, are usually ones that I try to go for. But the big question, of course, is who will actually start there? And we'll get to that in a second, but first, let's discuss some general themes and topics when it comes to their campaign and roster, and how Thrones of Decay might address them. Number 1, the biggest issue facing the Dawi currently, in my opinion, is that there's no real tangible benefit to reuniting the Kara's Angkor, the everlasting realm of the Dwarfs, which to me feels like a pretty big oversight, right? When that is quite literally the dream of any dwarf king, to reunite the lost holds and forge anew this great mountain kingdom, interconnected and prosperous. That this once massive mountain range spanning empire was one of the greatest powers the world had ever seen, winners of the War of Vengeance against a really powerful elven kingdom, and yet it all fell to ruin when earthquakes and evil races rose from the depths in revolt. Warhammer 3 needs to do something to encourage players to seek out those far-flung holds and bring them back into the fold, purging them of greenskins and ratmen as they go. And it can't just be landmarks. Landmarks are important, landmarks add a lot of flavor and fun to the game, but it shouldn't only be tied to certain buildings. Capturing Karak 8 Peaks as Thorgrim should be a massive deal. Retaking Karak Doom should be a massive deal. Not just in terms of those interesting landmarks, but in terms of boosting your economy, trade output, control, research rate, all that stuff. So as you incorporate more and more of these important Karaks into your empire, the famously slow growth and research rate the Dwarfs are so well known for in campaign should get some hefty boosts. Trade income, economic bonuses, all these things should become noticeably better the more you reconquer and claim as those underway routes open up again for the first time in millennia. I saw a really cool suggestion with Oath Gold, which tends to become redundant in mid to late game, where all your characters have Iron Warden's tankard regen and all the OP items, which frankly that's a problem unto itself. Could use some more diversity there so it's not just a cookie cutter build you use for every single lord and hero. But the resource becomes pointless pretty quick, Oath Gold that is, So why not give us an option to use that to fast travel between holds using the underway? I'm not sure it should be instant like a teleport, because it's not magical in nature like it'd be for the Wood Elves going from Athelorn to Lorelorn, Avalorn, Orion's camp, what have you. But quadruple movement range or something that allows for farther and faster resupply and reinforcement in the mountain holds you have connected would make a lot of sense and really reward players for restoring the Kara's Anchor. And then of course there's the question of the unit roster. Will Rune Golems, Guardians, and Shard Dragons be included as monstrous units? Should they be? If you've been following the channel for a long time, you likely know my stance on this matter, and for me, I'm still pretty firmly against them. I think tech like the Thunder Barge and Goblin Hewer could be great additions and have a very good shot at being added in this DLC, but bringing the rune statues alive and making them a core component of the Dwarf roster is just subtraction by addition. The Dawi are not about monstrous units, and if you add those into the game, unless you severely unit cap them, they're going to take over, essentially. It dilutes what makes the Dawi special and unique, takes away the focus from their infantry and war machines, and it will absolutely overshadow the core of their roster, giving them access to units that simply are not seen or used in any meaningful way in the current timeline of Warhammer Fantasy. The last time a Rune Guardian or Golem was used in combat was like millennia ago, essentially. There may have been shadows of that a little bit more recently, but it's just not a common thing for the Dawi to do. It's not in their army book, it's not how they're currently designed. Which, look, CA of course have been guilty of that in the past already. There have been plenty of units added that have homogenized factions, blurred the lines and diversity between them, or overshadowed other troop choices that came before. There has been power creep and stuff like that for other factions, no doubt about it. Carnate Elemental Beasts just being a better Gorgon in its first iteration on the Beastmen roster, or all these other Chaos units running around alongside normal Kislev humans are pretty good examples of this idea, I think. But Rune Golems and Guardians would be especially egregious here, as would adding a goddamn dragon, Shard Dragon, to a faction born and bred to hate and kill dragons, that have a hugely important cult dedicated to their eradication built into the foundations of their civilization. When I say a subtraction by addition, yeah, you're adding these new units. Yeah, now they have more diversity, but that diversity isn't always a good thing. And in this case, I think it would actually actively detract from the rest of the roster. I do not believe for a second the Dwarfs need them to function, nor do I believe they are thematically proper. And just because weird stuff like that has been done for other races in the past does not justify doing it for the Dwarfs now, because there are plenty of other very cool and truly thematic units that could still be added and benefit their race. With that said, just because I don't like them, Rune Guardians, Rune Golems, Shard Dragons, does not mean they are not coming, and I wouldn't be shocked if Creative Assembly adds them in some capacity, maybe as a unit capped endgame reward or something like that. I honestly don't know how Rich Aldrich and the GW boys feel about them on the Dwarf roster, so really it's up to them. I could see it going either way. So then we circle back to Legendary Lords, Legendary Heroes, and units that I do think will be added. Ungrim Iron Fist is of course the Legendary Lord that represents Slayers, Grim Burloxen is the Legendary Lord that represents Engineers, and Malachi Makaisen is the Legendary Hero that supports both. If the Thunder Barge is getting added, which I think it will as the main centerpiece unit for the Dawi, opposite the Toad Dragon for Nurgle, and Celestial Huracanum and or Marienburg Landship for Empire, then Malachi is by far the best hero choice. He quite literally teaches at the Nuln Gunnery School, huge hint towards his inclusion there, and has his very own airship, the Spirit of Grungni, not to mention close ties to Gotrek and Felix. Joseph Bugman, on the other hand, is also a possibility in the Legendary Hero slot. He was a hero in 8th edition tabletop for the Dawi, but I'm being honest when I say there are very few characters in the entire setting that I care about less. He's like on Conrad von Karstein tier for me. Does absolutely nothing for me, iconic or not. If they stealth dropped him tomorrow as a free lord, I probably would not care. Which is not to say you shouldn't like him. If your heart truly desires it, I wish you all the best and hope he makes it in at some point for your sake, but I think a Slayer Engineer on a big airship dropping bombs and handgun volleys from the sky sounds way cooler and adds a lot more to the game, and it's certainly more thematic here. I'd really like to see miners get some more weapon options like steam drills and the ability to tunnel into a specific location during the deployment phase, where they could lay in wait, then pop out of the ground with the click of a button, letting loose with a volley of blasting charges, then chug into melee. They had a lot more utility and cool options in tabletop than they currently have in Total War, which is a shame, because the tech already exists to at least let them behave like Menace Below summons, or something like that. So if Malachi is the legendary hero, that leaves Grim Burloxen as the obvious choice for legendary lord. He was a hero on the tabletop, but fits in well as a rebellious upstart lord, defying the Engineers Guild on a quest to Karak Azorn, and would be by far the best artillery support on the dwarf roster should he be added. Considering every other dwarf character besides Joseph Bugman is already in the game from the 8th edition, Thoric Ironbrow included, I think it's pretty much guaranteed Grim Burloxen is the next legendary lord for the Dawi, and I think he's a good choice. He wields a Grudgebreaker shotgun and a cog hammer in melee. He has a really cool tabletop model and would play quite unlike any of the other dwarf lords, both in terms of his own combat role and the armies he would recruit, which would be very heavy on the artillery side. Add in the Goblin Hero Slayer artillery, some Doomseekers with axes whirling around on chains, a Demon Slayer hero, and maybe a Drakefire pistol variant or something else that fits the theme of shooting and gunpowder that this Nuln DLC will offer, and I think we're looking at a really great roster for all three factions here. Obviously, there will be some give and take, but generally speaking, that is what Thrones of Decay will look like from the top down. It was not the hardest DLC to predict, simply because we know how many lords, heroes, and units are going to be added beforehand. It might be the first time that's ever happened, actually, and because 95% of it comes from the same army book, which kind of spells out everything for us, all in one very easy to read spot. But it's not a bad thing, because I've always really liked the Tamurkhan story arc, and most of the units it added, and this DLC could be a real nice way for Creative Assembly to get back on track with the series. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, and I'll see you all in the next video. Indie Pride, signing out for now. Have a good one, guys.